Next, what local, state, and federal governments can do to improve community college programs. Speakers included Obama administration Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker and Chris Liddell, White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Coordination. The hour-long event was part of an Aspen Institute Economic Strategy Group event.
Anybody hear this? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. Thanks very much, and welcome back to the second panel of this morning's program. I'll say that one thing I've certainly learned over the last year working with the Aspen Group is that there is just no debate about the significance of human capital in terms of raising both the potential and the actual improvement in working lives for Americans. But sort of asserting that human capital is important is one thing, but actually deciding what you do about it is another thing entirely. And one thing we've certainly learned in the last year and over, in fact, like many years, is that there's a wide variety of solutions and a big debate about the best way to go about that. I mean, do you start over, like you do tear up everything you have and start over anew with something new, or do you take what you already have and do you fix it? I think one way of the panel we have here is to discuss a specific proposal about taking the existing community college system and better targeting it towards outcomes. Now, one thing I do want to assert here is that there's good evidence to suggest there's a lot of potential in the community college system. Most of us are aware of the college premium in terms of like how it improves income for people who graduate from four-year colleges. What's lesser known is that is also true for people who graduate from two-year colleges with associate's degrees. Ann Stevens, who's not here, but who wrote one of the background papers in your volume, I strongly recommend it to you, has collected together a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that you get improvements of anywhere from 14 to 30% in earnings from a specific career and technical educational programs. But that's only part of the story, because the story also tells us that the results are not the same for all types of programs. They're not the same for all types of demographic groups. And so figuring out how you map your inputs in terms of resources to your outputs is a big part of the challenge. And that's what today's panel will be exploring. We have actually just a terrific group of people I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last year, some of whom I've known for a long time. We'll start with Glenn Hubbard, to my immediate right. He's the Dean of the Columbia Business School. He was also Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for George W. Bush. His co-author is Austin Goolsbee. He teaches economics at the University of Chicago. He was Chairman of Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Next to him is Penny Pritzker. She's a founder of PSP Partners, a private investment firm. She also spent 4 years as Commerce Secretary for Barack Obama and has written probably more studies on human capital than we've ever read. Next to her is Juan Salgado, who is a real practitioner. He is Chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago, basically overseeing the education of 80,000 students over 7 colleges. And to his right, we're pleased to have Chris Liddell, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Trump administration, especially for policy coordination. And before that, he was Chief Financial Officer for General Motors. Glenn and Austin, we'll start with you. Let's hear about the proposal.
Sure, and again, I'd like to join the chorus of thanks to Hank and Ersten for setting all of this up. There's a huge topic, obviously, about supporting work, but part of it is preparedness. And so the group project we were engaged in was trying to look at the intersection of what works and what's doable in the present political environment. And it's specifically about a proposal for supply-side investment in community colleges. Greg already mentioned the idea of a premium. It's a big number. If you complete college, and complete is an important part of this tale, wages are about 65% higher over your lifetime than for those with only a high school diploma. The country has done relatively well in increasing the share of students going to college, but the data on earnings outcomes are about completing college, and there we've done less well. About half of college-bound students fail to complete a degree within 6 years, even more so at public institutions than selective private institutions. And that same problem has been endemic to community colleges too. Community colleges play a huge role in the system for training people in practical skills, They also train the bulk of economically disadvantaged students. 44% of community college students come from families making less than $25,000 a year. And increasingly, there's a huge need among non-college bound students to build skills, the credential movement, the CTE studies to which Greg referred. What's our idea? I want to give an idea and a frame. The opportunity is, again, that college degrees pathway to economic opportunity is there. The big idea is a federal grant program to provide new funding to community colleges conditional on educational outcomes and institutional outcomes. And the frame is really something like a 21st century moral land grant program. I know people think big ideas can't be done. Well, I would remind everybody the Morrill Act was passed and enacted during the Civil War, arguably a challenging time. So I think we can do this. And the idea would be to make the federal grant program contingent on institutional outcomes. The goal: we want to increase the supply of college education workers. This is a supply side program. Always delighted to have Austin with me on the supply side. It is going to respond to unmet needs and unmet demand for mid-career skill development. The proposal we outline in our chapter also lays out some ideas we won't talk about today unless you ask about them on public-private training partnerships, data issues, and the reform of the Pell Grant. One twist here that's really important when I call this supply side incentive, this is directed to colleges, to community colleges, as opposed to tuition aid. So currently there's a debate in the body politic, the free tuition debate. We are on the supply side of that debate. Our focus would be on institutional outcomes and measurements. Specifically, we're trying to do two things. One is close the completion gap between 2- and 4-year schools. To do that, that would be taking the community college completion rate from something like 37.5% up to 60%. We're trying to target to do that by 2030 for those of you who are budgeteers. And that would bring about 3.6 million new 18 to 24-year-olds with better credentials. The second goal is to actually match the workforce with skills. So if you look in the year 2030, about 65% of working Americans, so we're talking about that as 25 to 64, would need a high-quality credential. Community college, or some equivalent credential. So we'd like to increase the share of Americans having that to 65% by 2030. That would affect 28 million Americans. So I'll turn it over to Austin to tell you how it all works.
Okay, a couple of points. Now, we actually have another, there's three of us authored this paper. Amy Gans, who you met this morning, is our other
so all the hard questions.
Co-author. Yeah, we're gonna pass to her. I was just going to talk about three things. The first is why take a supply side approach rather than a make college free, let's have debt-free college, or more aim at the students. And our view first is that the evidence is pretty strong, as Greg alluded to, that the existing community college system is actually quite effective at raising earnings and establishing either new to career or people changing careers. It has been quite affordable. The average tuition to the students is around $3,500 a year. And yet at the same time, the returns are as high as they've ever been. The community colleges are starved for resources. And over the last 10 years, the support that the states have given to their community college systems has really been squeezed more and more, and that has forced the community colleges to up the tuition and fees so that now the tuition and fees are a higher share of the spending than they've ever been. The federal government has tried through Pell Grants and others to fill some of the gap, but it hasn't done so. So at the same time, the demand benefits have never been higher. The supply has never been tighter. And the evidence, in addition to the payoffs to people's wages, the question of does increasing the resources to the schools improve the performance of the students. There are a number of papers, some of which are random controlled trials, which show quite convincingly that as you increase the resources to the community colleges, the better the outcomes are for the students who are going there. And that's not all, some of those are targeted programs, and we talk about in the paper career advice, academic coaching, curricular advice, just to explain to people, look, you actually have enough credits. If you just take 2 more classes, you can complete your associate's degree, or making it easy for people to transfer once they get an associate's degree to a 4-year college if they want to continue. We have a number of areas in which we highlight institutional resources could improve the completion rate, and the data suggests that it has done that. And then the second thing is a major focus of our paper, and a major focus for the Council on Foreign Relations and others, has been the recognition that the world of skills and training cannot just be restricted to people that are 25 years old and less. So we need to target adults, and community colleges are one of the only institutions that have shown effectiveness in the retraining or upskilling of adult learners for career and technical education. You will see the members of our group are diverse. They have diverse backgrounds. They are of diverse political parties. We found we could agree on accountability being an important aspect, that if you're going to fund the schools on the supply side to try to avoid the problem of, if you just hand all money to demand, it might drive up the tuition and drive up the costs of the limited resource. We want the funding to the schools to be dependent on things like, what are the completion rates, as well as what are the student characteristics, what are the local labor market conditions, and how the performance is going. In an effort not to avoid the schools from simply cream skimming and say, well, if you're going to give us more funding for having people graduate, we're just not going to take anyone that's at risk of not graduating. That would really quite defeat the purpose. So in the funding formula, we wanted to take into account inputs as well as outputs, let's call it. And we want to, mindful of some of the experiences in states of the recession, we want to require that they maintain or increase the funding of the system they have now, not if this program increases funding, then they say, okay, well, then we can take away the funding for what I already did and spend it on something else. Our cost estimate is really 2 parts of almost equal size. One is a series of investments to increase the completion rate or transfer to 4-year college rate at community colleges for people age 18 to 24. That one's about $12 billion. And then raising the either high quality credential or graduation rate for adults 25 to 64, that's about $10 billion. So together we say $22 billion. To put in some perspective, the free tuition plans are about $50 billion. The debt-free college plans are about $85 billion. So our view was, before trying to reinvent the wheel or create something new, let's collectively target something that we know has been working, is cost effective, and is getting choked off for various reasons, and that's how we got where we are.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Austin. Penny, I'd like to turn to you now. You've spent a lot of time, a lot of years thinking about both U.S. competitiveness and the skills gap. Can you tell us about how you think U.S. Career technical education system is holding back the U.S.'s competitiveness? And what's your take on how this proposal would target the unmet needs that you've identified?
Well, as you said, I'm passionate about this issue of workforce training, and it's only more and more the evidence is showing as artificial intelligence and automation are changing the nature of work. We have to help Americans adapt and thrive in this economy. And, Americans are nervous. We know this. Pew has told us this. Edelman, you look at study after study. And so I view this as the economic issue of our time. The question is, why are community colleges critical and vital to a systems change? That's really, in my mind, a fundamental issue that this group has undertaken. And if you look at community colleges, they're a gateway to a four-year college. If you look at a third of Americans who begin their ability to get through four-year colleges, they begin at community colleges. 3/4 of those students are low income. And one of the issues that I know Hank raised earlier and Erskine is this whole question of, we're leaving too many Americans behind. And so this is a vital, demonstrated organizations, community colleges, that can deliver. And we know that 2/3 of community college students are economically disadvantaged. Only 10% today are over the age of 40. That we need to improve, and that's part of what we're calling for, is to make the community colleges a place where someone who needs retraining feels really comfortable going and knows that the credentials that they're going to get are valuable. So how does this fit into competitiveness, and why do I think that community colleges are so incredibly important? Is because they're a critical link between the business community and the worker, and they're closest to the ground, which is really critical. I think it's very hard, sort of from a national policy, except from the standpoint of financing, to decide what do you need in Chicago versus what do you need in Wichita. If you look at Chicago, the industries that are most important to us are things like healthcare and hospitality and logistics. If you look at Wichita, it's aviation, right? And so those communities, each of those communities have found a way, and you'll hear from Rahm Emanuel, later, but each community has found a way, or one, to connect its community colleges with its most important industries and sectors. And that's really important for competitiveness, because at the end of the day, the skills that are needed as technology is changing are evolving. And what a student or a reskilling worker needs to know is, if I go and take that course, am I going to be better off in my work life? Is this going to lead me to a higher income? Is this going to help my career? Is that credential valuable to me? And what we've seen in Chicago, and Juan will talk about this, whether it's the Apprenticeship 2020 program, or it's the tech boot camps, or it's the programs that we're doing around logistics or other areas of our economy, Juan has the schools that are most closely able to work with the local business community to say, here's what I need in this area. And that's true around the country. You see it in Wichita. They absolutely built technical schools to service the aviation industry. The aviation industry in Wichita is 1 in every 5 jobs. And so, and the credentials that you get, there's a massive number of them, are all valued by the employers in that community. So this kind of flexibility, this ability to work on the ground in a community is really critical. What I like about the proposal that we've made is, and how it enhances competitiveness, it's really not saying, here's a solution. It's saying, what we need to do is take under-resourced assets, which our community colleges have been, their resources are under pressure. State budgets are under pressure, and the federal government has not kept up. We need to take these very effective resources, using the evidence that we've got, give them more juice so that they can help our American workforce be more competitive and productive in the opportunities that exist in those communities.
Thanks very much, Penny. Juan, you're here because you're the practitioner. You actually are there on the front lines trying to figure out how to match resources to needs. Tell us about what are the strains and the stresses you face trying to serve the needs of this community of students, and how is this proposal, in your view, is it an improvement over what you have today?
Yeah, let me just say that when I think about the proposal, I think about specifically what's occurred in the state of Illinois over the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen an over 33% decline in state resources to higher education, which we've also seen at the community college level, we've seen a year where we didn't have a state budget for most of the year. And despite that, what I face daily is what my students face daily. On a daily basis, I have students that are coming to class that are also hungry. Food insecurity in community colleges at a record high. I have students that have not one but 2 jobs, balance that with their studies, along with being parents themselves, right, at the same time. So the time that they have to actually parent and care for the next generation, severely limited. Students that come from geographies in Chicago. While we have a booming economy, we have neighborhoods in Chicago with 48% of the people living there, the young people, 24 to working age adults that are out of school, out of work. We have those are African American neighborhoods. We have Latino neighborhoods with 30% out of school, men out of school and out of work. And so we have a confluence of students that are coming with trauma that has occurred in their lives for a variety of reasons. And yet students that are, 75% of our students still have to take a developmental education class, whether it's a math class or an English class. And so we are faced with figuring out how to properly support those students with fewer resources. And at the same time, be incredibly responsive to business. Because if we're not incredibly responsive to business, these students won't have the competitive edge. They don't have the networks. They don't have the experience base. There's not someone in their life that has exposed them to economic opportunity. That's why institutions like ours are bridge connectors. We're open the doors to students, to the private sector, to economic opportunity. And so when I look at that proposal, it offers community colleges the opportunity for creativity and innovation, along with accountability. In Chicago, we've made great strides. We went from a 7% graduation rate to now over 24%. And we've doubled the number of students that have transferred, that complete and transfer onto four-year institutions. We've doubled the number of students that actually get credentials of economic value, including their associate's degree. As a system, we've done this because we've been incentivized by what I would call Chicago pride, and a mayor that's been relentless, and you'll hear from him a little while ago, in making sure that what we do at our college is tied to the growing areas of our economy, period. And so that means you have to change institutionally, and that's hard to do, right? And so I see the proposal also as an opportunity to create an avenue where community colleges get incentivized to drop that course offering that's no longer in demand and add the one that is, and to create responsive efforts to adults. Right now, there is not a funding mechanism really that works in the United States of America for adults trying to return to work. You talked about career and technical education. How are we funding, by and large, our career and technical education? It's through philanthropy and through trying to scratch and claw it all together, okay? The boot camps that Penny talked about, we put up some cybersecurity boot camps that are intended to get people to come back into the workforce and get into high demand jobs. It's actually through Penny's foundation that we got that done. Why? Because the systems don't work that way. And you look at ITAs and the workforce board, well, the level of paperwork required and the limited amount of those ITAs create a system that really at the end of the day doesn't work. So we need some flexible dollars to be able to move quickly to meet that overall demand. And one of the things I love about it, by the way, and look, it has accountability built in. You all have said that we've got a window till 2030 for this to work. Otherwise, it goes away. And I think that's important too, because community colleges can't just see this as a new source of revenue. They have to see this as seed funding to make change happen that will truly impact their students.
Well, thanks very much. Chris, I'd like to turn to you now. Obviously, tell us about what the administration's approach to workforce development issues is. I know there's been a lot of emphasis on apprenticeships, for example. Is the administration's approach complementary to or competitive with what you're hearing today? Is there overlap?
Sure, and firstly, thanks to Aspen Institute for doing this. It's incredibly important. Let me give you a little bit of context, and then I'll drill down on the specific issue at hand. In terms of context, other than my general role for policy coordination across the whole of the White House, the two areas that I'm most interested in are how America wins in the industries of the future and how we have workforce training. And those two are obviously linked with each other. When I start with industries of the future, I think it's critical for our country from a national security point of view, from a prosperity point of view, and from a social point of view, that we win in the industries of artificial intelligence, 5G, advanced manufacturing, synthetic biology, and quantum computing. And as you've seen from a lot of the literature, not all jobs are going to go away, but all jobs to a large extent are going to be impacted to a certain extent by those industries. So in order to win in those industries, we need to have the people to do it. And you've already seen that we have 6 million job openings in the country. We have 6 million unemployed people, but we don't have people with the right skills. That's only going to get worse in the future. So clearly this is a critical issue. It's not only critical from an economic point of view, it's critical from a social point of view. And I think we have to look at the whole system in total. So I'll make a couple of comments, but then I'll drill down into the role of community colleges inside the system. I was struck by something that Oren Cass wrote a little while ago that some of you might have seen, which is basically at the current system, a fifth of people drop out of high school, a fifth of people graduate from high school but go straight into the workforce, a fifth of people go to college but drop out of college, a fifth of people go to college, graduate, but then get a job that doesn't actually need what they just graduated with. And only a fifth of people basically go through the system as it is, which is go to high school, go to college, graduate, and get a job that relates to what they just graduated from. So the system, which made a lot of sense 100 years ago, doesn't actually make any sense anymore. So we need to address the system overall. And as I think you said in your paper, there's no single bullet to that. In terms of the way the administration's looking at it and the way I think about it, we set up something called the National Council for the American Worker 6 months ago, which brings together all of the senior people inside the agencies and also inside the White House to address it with three basic objectives. One, obviously, we want to coordinate our policy and resources, and I'll come back to that specifically as it addresses these issues. The second is we want to work with the private sector, so we're going to announce in the next couple of weeks a fantastic group of pretty much the leading CEOs and some of the college administrators to think about public-private partnerships and the role of that. And I know some of the work Penny and others have done building on that, which has been fantastic. And the third, to be honest, is changing perception. A lot of this is about this mentality that the four-year college is the only way that you're actually going to succeed in life. For some percentage of people, that's true. For a lot of people, that's not true. Lifelong learning is going to be much more important, and community colleges have an incredibly important role. So in terms of the policy settings, coming back to that aspect of it, you skipped over the ancillary recommendations, but in fact, I would have started there and then gone to the area, because I think there's an incredible power in that, and there's a high degree of alignment between what you suggested and what I think we as an administration believe in. So reforming the Pell Grant system is obviously on that list. Currently, it's inflexible. It doesn't actually apply to short-term, more flexible programs. If we brought that in, it would allow, in particular, some of the mature students that you're talking about who have left and want to come back into the industry to actually get the skills that they need rather than having to go through the whole 2 years. So Pell Grant is definitely one. Accreditation, we need a different accreditation system to think about outcomes, not inputs. You relate to that a bit with your suggestions. New partnerships. So community colleges can't do it all on their own. They need to think about partnerships with non-traditional providers, whether they be online, boot camps or whatever, that relates to the Pell Grant and the accreditation. There's no point in putting those partnerships in if you can't get the funding or can't get the actual credentials associated with it. New public-private partnerships. You mentioned apprenticeships. That's something we obviously believe in. The previous administration believed in, put a lot of effort into. You've probably seen the statistics. We have like 100,000 apprenticeships a year. roughly, virtually all of which are in the construction sector. If we just, most people think about Germany when they think about apprenticeships. If you just think about Britain or Canada or some of the other countries that maybe look a little bit more like us from a workforce point of view, if we had the same number of apprenticeships as them, we'd have over 1 million. So it's a vast source of opportunity. And when you think about what people are giving up in order to come into training, obviously earn and learn type structures make a lot more sense. So a lot of fantastic things happening already in the public-private partnership. That's something that through this council and through all the associated works makes a lot of sense. And then data, which is another one of the areas that you had. We think the power of data in this area is phenomenal. It's one of the least, along with healthcare, one of the least well-dated area. So having a data schema that basically connects employers, employees, training organizations in a systematic way. The amount of data that we have at the moment is primitive. It doesn't really give any of those people what they need in order to produce the courses of the future for employees to figure out what the right courses are and what their returns are to get employers connected with those people. So a lot of work we're going on. This is not something the government is going to own, but we want to facilitate the private sector moving to a much more powerful use of data in the workforce, and we think that will enable it. So those are the sort of areas which pretty much are all in your paper, which we fundamentally aligned with. A lot of those we can do by regulation, but not to a significant extent. Most of the things I just talked about will require legislative change. I was chatting just beforehand. This is an area which I think at least you can be optimistic because there's a reasonable amount of bipartisan agreement. So if we're able to get the Higher Education Act passed again in the next 18 months, then I think this is an area, those areas that I talked about, at least there are fertile grounds for that. On the who pays for it, coming to that, in my experience, I'm Chief Financial Officer by background. In my experience, virtually nothing in the government is we underspend in. This is an area perhaps in the community college area we look at, but we spend something like $160 billion on higher education at the moment. We spend another $20 billion on workforce training programs. There's 47 workforce training programs that make up that $20 billion. A lot of that doesn't probably make sense. So to the first place I would look would probably be where we currently spend before I spent more money. But interestingly, if you solve some of the other problems, which is why I started there, if you have a short-term program, you don't need 2 years of funding. You might only need 6 months of funding or whatever the program is. And obviously, if you stop people from dropping out, and I was staggered by the figures of community colleges, I think it's like 40% graduation rate on. If you stop people from falling out, dropping out, and they qualify for a Pell Grant or a loan, then by definition the funding is going to go up because that's not a finite resource that goes with the employee. So actually you would increase funding just by solving some of the other problems. And by having things like apprenticeships and earn for learn, you can bring more funding in from non-federal. So I think it's a fantastic initiative. I think it's got a lot of merit in not just the core, but all the things around it, and certainly to a large extent aligned with what we're doing.
Terrific, thanks. I'd like to drill down on the funding formula for your proposal, Glenn and Austin, which I think is one of the most intriguing innovations here. So to recap, your formula would basically look at the types of kids that the colleges are taking in. You get more money if they're more difficult kids. You know, they come from a worse background. And it's also linked to outcomes, you know, better outcomes, more money. Juan, I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about that formula? That's obviously going to put constraints on what you can do. Do you like the idea of having the federal funds you get geared to those types of inputs and outputs?
I don't just like it, I love it. Okay, I love it because the current system is the opposite in many respects. The current system actually provides fewer resources for those students that you might say need it the most, right? And because of the way we tax locally, right, and other factors. And so, what this does is ensure, right, that colleges are focused on those students. And the way you focus on them, by the way, is, and Austin talked a little about this, is by reaching out to them and bringing them in, right? And so if there's not an incentive structure that says bring them in, then what you're going to get is folks targeting the outcomes and the outcomes only. And we're going to start to limit access. We should be broadening access. The only way to get to the economic goals that we have as a country is to make sure that these communities and these populations of students are fully included, fully supported, and that they reach the outcomes that we would want our children to reach as well. So I love it.
Glenn or Austin, could one of you speak to why you moved in that direction? And one of the contexts here is that the Obama administration introduced something called the Gainful Employment Rule, which basically conditioned eligibility for federal loan aid on the outcomes of those colleges. This created a lot of controversy. I believe the current administration has not been very favorable towards it, partly because the for-profit college sector was disproportionately affected by it. So why did you hit upon this formula, and how do you deal with some of the criticisms that were raised about the Obama administration's approach?
Well, I think we started just from the perspective that completion was the problem we were trying to solve, that community colleges were an entity that seemed to be working in delivering those things, so we tried to marry those two. And then the question is, how do you stop the cream skimming that Austin referred to? Because that's bad. If you just throw money at community colleges and say, take the best kids, well, then we haven't really solved the problem. So it was really thinking about it no harder than that. Completion, community colleges work, and how do you solve the cream skimming? We would hope, I think, as a working group, that this is fundable. I mean, Chris is absolutely right. We spent a lot on workforce training. Part of the problem is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act is a different budget animal than workforce. I mean, it's all hard, but in principle, this should be doable.
Yeah, and I guess I would say it in two parts. Let's hold the gainful employment discussion for 1 second. In the previous panel, you heard the rural versus urban conflict. Community colleges are both, A, they're working, and B, they're everywhere. They're in places. So if you go, my parents are retired in Abilene, Texas. Well, there's junior colleges. There's community colleges there. This is not a thing where we're inventing new institutions or we have to encourage everybody pick up from where you are and go to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and go to the University of Michigan, and then go to a city, move to Chicago, and you're never go back to where you were. The evidence that the institutions are there and working was kind of central, and we wanted to, if you want to increase completion, you got to kind of go to the margin. Where are people dropping out? And the cream skimming margin is problematic on that front if you just look at outcomes, not inputs. Now, on gainful employment, I know a lot about that. That was first coming in when I was in the Obama administration. That was only applied to for-profits. Okay, so that was only about for-profit education, and it said if the job that you're going to take will not pay enough to pay back the loans on average, then your students can't qualify for federal grants. Now, I think that's a totally reasonable idea, and the area of for-profit education, as anybody knows who starts looking at, is full of a bunch of, I won't say bad actors, but there are very problematic circumstances where people are entering culinary programs that are charging them $35,000 a year, and the average salary when they're graduating is $25,000 a year. And so how are they going to ever pay back the loans? By the measures of gainful employment, one of the controversies was, well, why don't you apply those to private schools, and could a Harvard philosophy major satisfy the gainful employment rule? Now, actually, they probably could, no matter what their major was. But community colleges look amazing by any of these standards. Community college charge $3,500 a year. And so there is no criteria, there's no gainful employment criteria that community colleges will fail. And that's kind of the thing that motivated us of, what are we doing? This is the most cost-effective form of documentedly good skills, and we're squeezing them for resources at exactly the moment when if you were going to expand, that's what you would expand.
So if I could clarify, so outcomes are one of the criteria about how much funding an institution gets, right? Are those the outcomes of that institution, or is it a broader sort of like coast-to-coast type of criteria. And the reason I ask is because I can imagine one, like for example, your formula essentially says the outcomes of a previous cohort will determine how much money you get for this cohort. But you might say, that cohort we took in 4 years ago, that was a particularly difficult cohort, for the following circumstances. You're basically punishing us because we took in some tough kids 4 years ago.
But the trends are fairly steady. And I think that in most geographies like our system, the number of Pell eligible, the number of students that are in need of certain assistance, if you created incentives for us to go out and get more students like that. I'll give you an example. We created a partnership with the Chicago Housing Authority, specific supports to Housing Authority residents so that they can achieve at higher rates. And guess what happened? They did, right? Chicago Housing Authority residents are now graduating at higher percentages than a normal student coming in that's not a CHA resident because they got a little extra support that CHA is providing in-house. And so, but let's create the incentives so that we go out, not just them, by the way, diverse learners. Our universities, by and large, don't take diverse learners, and our high schools are full of diverse learners. What are we doing to help our diverse learners? And so by creating these input incentives, along with the output incentives, you create a whole system that I think is more in line with our values as a nation than what we have right now.
But you're right, we are doing it at the level of the institution.
Okay, yeah.
So that,
Yeah, okay.
just to be clear.
I don't know what the alternative.
I don't know how you
got to base it on the data that they had,
Okay.
and if 2 years before they had a tough, nobody graduated or they didn't complete. We got to.
Into this funding issue, Juan mentioned the squeezing earlier. We found in the papers 75 cents on the dollar, community college to four-year state school, and that's getting worse and worse. I mean, we're squeezing the very institution that actually works.
Thanks. In a few minutes, we'll have some time, I hope, for some questions from you all. If you do have a question, please write it down on a note card and then pass it to a person who will pick it up in the aisle and bring it to me. But a few more questions. We haven't talked much about apprenticeships, but clearly that is one of the alternative approaches to improving career technical education. Glenn or Austin, could one of you just briefly explain why you went in this direction? And then Penny, I'd like your thoughts on apprenticeship versus community college.
We did in our ancillary programs. We do talk about apprenticeships. It's not that we're opposed to apprenticeships, especially if done in public-private partnership. The one thing to remember is that the average apprenticeship costs something like $30,000 a year. And so in a world in which you can get a community college education and vocational skill training for 1/8, 1/10 the price, that's why we made this our priority.
Penny?
So
Although you do have an expert right there who's disagreeing with you, but that's
our experience is that the community colleges are essential to apprenticeships. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen is that particularly as we're evolving apprenticeships in our city to be more white-collar apprenticeships in addition to the construction apprenticeships and others, that the community colleges, and frankly we also need the mentoring organizations who are helping, the support organizations. We have to combine them with the community college to help the young person be ready for the apprenticeship. What we're seeing is an explosion of apprenticeships because they're working for the employer, but they're not possible without the community college. It's not like you just go out and as an employer and say, please come to apply for my apprenticeship. The community colleges have become essential in qualifying students, in providing the education that's complementary to the apprenticeship, in partnering with the organizations that are providing social service and mentoring services to the young people, so that when they're showing up at the apprenticeship, they're job ready, if you will. And we're seeing our CEOs are thrilled with the outcomes. And we've gone, I think, from 50 white collar to 400 this year, and we're going to be at 500 or 600 next year. And I think we can, our goal is 10,000.
I mean, it raises one point of let's call it economic theory, which is as the job market has evolved from you get one job and you stay in that job for your whole life, the incentives of employers to invest in what the economists would consider basic skills has gone way down. So now if you look in the data, the average person now has had 14 different jobs by age 48. Okay, in a world where you got 14 jobs by age 48, no one of those 14 employers wants to pay for stuff that I'm going to pay to educate you basic skills that you're going to then go take to somebody else. So the community college can play into the apprenticeship.
And what Juan has had to do is partner with the private, with philanthropy to try and cobble together the support structure as well as extra resources in the community college to be able to create this pipeline that's having massive success. This is where an incentive, a federal incentive, would be so effective to outcomes driven, but basically gives someone Juan and his peers around the country the opportunity to create, to be innovative, to meet this demand and need.
Yeah, so I totally agree. Penny, I see community colleges as being fundamental to the whole apprenticeship program. So again, it's redefining what apprenticeships mean with a much more broad thought. We think about them in the very traditional sense. This is a 16-year-old kid who wants to go into welding or whatever. We are talking potentially about a 35-year-old person who wants retraining. And it could be in white collar, it could be in the industries of the future. It doesn't have to be in traditional sort of blue collar jobs. So if you think of earn and learn as opposed to apprenticeship is really a subset of that. And community colleges are fundamental, and for all the reasons that Austin was saying before, they have the breadth, they have the local knowledge, they have the connection with businesses in the local communities. So they are the perfect people to deliver the programs necessary. All we need to do is redefine and give them the flexibility to do that.
And just so we in Chicago set a goal, 50% of our completers will have an earn and learn opportunity before they graduate. Traditionally, those kinds of opportunities are thought of for students in their junior and senior year. We believe that to reach the adults and the young people coming in our system, doing it in freshman, sophomore year, doing it earlier on, it's going to be helpful.
Thanks. I'll turn to a few questions here. Now, this is, I think, is a very good question. Unfortunately, he or she's using some acronyms that hopefully you can fill in for me as I go along. With outcomes funding for colleges based on completion, the fastest and least expensive degrees to produce at a community college are AA and AS degrees. AA stands for?
Associate of Arts.
And AS is
Associate of Science.
Thank you. We know these don't have the labor market returns we see in more expensive AAS degrees. AAS is?
Associate of Arts Science.
Is that right? Is that right? Okay. Have you considered?
That was a new one on me.
Have you considered all associate's degrees are not created equal? How do you account for that differentiation in your funding model? The possibility that there are certain degrees that are a better investment than others.
Well, in some sense, that's going to be linked to an outcomes measure, because how well people are ultimately doing in the labor market, to the extent that that statement is true, that should be in the data. If you have
Yeah, look, my only, the most optimistic thing about labor force training policy is that it doesn't just rely on some person at the Department of Labor to figure out what the jobs of the future will be and what training everybody has. Everybody who's going out to community colleges, absolutely. And if you look at Chicago city colleges or any others, the students, they want to know, well, wait a minute, what is it and where do they go? What can I take and what can I use it? So if they are short programs, certificate programs, let's say, that aren't going to have as big of a bang for the buck, I think they may have some harder time recruiting.
I think it's the wrong choice. I don't think you're comparing one degree to another. I think you should think of the whole menu. So you should be comparing it to a 6-week boot camp, a blended online, offline course that might take a year, of which the two degrees that you just mentioned are just two choices of 10, not one versus the other.
And I think we're missing the concept of stackable credentials as well. Okay, which is key here. I mean, in most community colleges in our system, there's not any coursework that you're taking that doesn't stack into the next set of courses that stacks into an associate's degree and a 4-year degree. And so I think that we've got to build into the proposal the concept of stackable credentials.
Juan, I remember, I think it was you that told me this, that one of the problems you face is that some of the degrees that are most in demand and have the best outcomes, like nursing, like IT, are also the most expensive for you to offer. They require a lot of facilities and so forth, you know? So that creates a real kind of like almost a contradiction between need, demand, and supply. How do you get around that? And does this formula address that?
We just opened a $45 million Center for Advanced Manufacturing and Engineering. You see the equipment that we have there. You can only put so many students on that piece of equipment. So you're exactly right. Again, I think that those programs are going to result in higher income. And here's or more steady income. It can't always just be how high is your income. There's also a question of how steady is that over time. Let me just say that the way we're collecting data is very problematic for community colleges. Graduation rates don't tell our story. Income growth does. And we've got to find an easy way for us to be able to tell ourselves and our students, here are the programs where your income's going to grow in this direction and that direction because of the data showing us that. We don't have that by and large in our community college system as a whole.
The following question is actually my sort of like incorporation of a few ideas I've got here, but it's one I've thought about a lot, which is the distinction between soft skills and hard skills. So a lot of the things that employers raise isn't just whether or not the graduate has the hard skills necessary to do this specific occupation, but the soft skills, the communicative, the ability to communicate, the attendance, the sort of like creative problem solving and so forth. Glenn or Austin, could one of you talk about whether your proposal specifically addresses that? And in particular, I'm intrigued by the emphasis you give to increasing funding for in-course support to help kids finish the degree as opposed to the actual provision of the degree. Why did you come to that conclusion? And I'd like to hear if any of the other panelists have views on whether support for soft skills needs to be part of the solution.
It's very important. And we weren't trying to say that this is only about so-called hard skills and not soft skills. The resilience, the attendance, all those are soft skills. But some of these things Austin referred to are very important. The data show people often drop out for very small expenditures. The idea of mentioned the student that's working and has children and suddenly has to drop out for lack of $500. There's small interventions that can keep students engaged that then build that resilience and soft skills.
Yeah, and one of them was career counseling and career mentors. So we definitely had that in mind. Now, it's still always going to be the case that it's hard to teach communication. It's hard to teach EQ. To some people, it's harder than other people to teach, those skills.
It's hard to teach some MBAs EQ.
That's what I'm saying. Professors are the lowest on the.
But funding for this kind of support really doesn't exist institutionally.
Yes.
Really, what's happening is more and more of it's being done by philanthropy, and that's not sustainable. I think philanthropy can be like the venture capital. It can show the system how it can work, but at some point we need to acknowledge you need either, whether it's career counselors or it's also, we see it with the DACA kids that we're putting through school. They're persisting at a 70% rate through college, 4-year college in 4 years. But we've also got folks they're in 20 schools in Illinois. And we've got someone in each of those schools that is a resource for them so that, as Austin said, the $500 problem doesn't become the reason they drop out of school. And you see the same in the apprenticeship program that we're doing, which is these kids need some wraparound services, not huge, but enough that there's a resource for them to go to when they hit a skid.
Take any young person and put them in a corporate environment that's new to them. Take one of our students that has never really been in a downtown office building, let alone in the corporate suite. They're going to need some supports. I believe the soft skills discussion is a discussion about access and opportunity. That we have soft skills because we've been exposed to environments and coached along the way through many, many years. Our students all should benefit from that coaching. And so, it's getting that career coaches in the colleges, and it's getting the earn and learn opportunities in the real workplaces.
One initiative is not the solution, but certainly helps is credentialing and certification. And there's some interesting initiatives going on there, mainly driven out of the private sector, but we need the private sector to recognize credentialing in a much more systematic and broad-based fashion. You can certify some of these skills, whether it's analytical problem solving or teamwork or whatever. At the moment, you just don't have a common understanding of what that means, and you don't have an acceptance by the private sector that that's something that they will recruit against. So most of the recruiting, it comes down to some extent data, to some extent it's perception. They'll recruit against, I need a degree in this, but what they should be looking for is the following sets of skills certified by an institution that actually teaches them.
But we've heard, as recently as the first panel, how occupational licensing has become a barrier to mobility. How do we prevent credentialing from becoming just another form of occupational licensing that erects artificial barriers to mobility?
I think the credentialing should be owned by the people who employ the people. So credentialing should be industry driven. It is to some extent already, but there's something like, I don't know what the figure is, 8,000 credentials. So you need industries to come together and say, we will actually certify the credential holders and the nature of the credentials and get it much more systematic. Then you actually need employers to employ against it and training institutions to train against it as well. So it's happening, but it's still embryonic.
We have just a few minutes left. Let's sort of turn to the easiest question of all, which is about funding and money. So a question here, what do you think of the idea of tax incentives for corporations who to spend on mentoring, internships, apprenticeships, any of this training? Any thoughts on the panel?
I think it's the opposite. You should incent corporations to take in take in apprenticeships and provide internships, not to tax them for doing
No, this is the opposite.
He's saying
Tax incentives for it. Should there be tax incentives to do that?
Yes.
Yes.
There should be. I mean, I think we need to prove out pipeline, right? The construction of local pipelines, and then you want to explode the opportunities so that smaller corporations can provide the same opportunities, and that's what we're trying to do in Chicago is be the pilot. Aon and Accenture have been really the funding source for bringing together a consortium of 20 plus employers now. But ultimately, we need apprenticeships in a box, and we need a pipeline that is durable through the community colleges with the social service supports.
I would say yes to all of that, but I would go back to Austin's basic econ point. The problem is you do have a free rider problem in training, because if I train people, they just go to work for a penny. But you could solve the tax incentives. We have tax mechanisms to deal with that, but I think you'd want to do that in conjunction with the community college expansion. I think both together can be pretty powerful.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the reasons for success of our effort in Chicago is that the apprentices are a real business solution to those companies. And so I think that while you can have a tax incentive, it should be a little additive, but I think that there's real value in these earn and learn being real business value to those companies.
Okay, I think we're just a little bit past our time, but lightning round, I'm going to finish with this the easiest question of all. Yes or no, should we raise taxes to pay for this initiative? $22 billion a year?
If that were the only way to do it, I would do it. I would suggest spending cuts could account for much of it, along the lines Chris said, but yes, absolutely.
Austin?
Yes, we should.
But he always says that.
In our proposal, we talk a bit about the original land grant formulation, but with a very few exceptions, the land grants were not land to put the university on that land. They were, here's surplus property that the government has that we will give to you. You sell and you use the proceeds to establish the school. So
Penny?
I'm where Chris and Glenn are. I think there's opportunity to move money around to make this happen.
But we'll put Guam on the table if we have to.
Juan, should we raise taxes to pay for this initiative?
I think ultimately you're going to have to. I don't think you can wring as much as you think you're going to from the system as it is.
Chris?
I don't think the final ticket will be quite as high as what we've seen if we do it right, and I'd reallocate it.
Thanks very much. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. Okay.
Coming up on C-SPAN, Stacey Abrams, former Democratic candidate for Georgia governor, on health care. After that, a panel